The scent of burnt clutch fluid is hard to wash out. It clings to the skin just like the sting of a billionaire's insult. She thought her money gave her the right to treat him like dirt. She was wrong. The engine didn't care about her bank account. Neither did he. The fan in the corner of the garage had a persistent rhythmic click. It didn't cool the air. It just pushed the heavy, exhaust-choked August heat around in circles. Dean lay flat on his back, staring up at the rusted underbelly of a 2008 Honda Civic. A drop of dirty condensation fell from the tailpipe, landing dead center on his cheek. He didn't blink. He just wiped it away with the back of a hand that hadn't been completely clean in 15 years. His knuckles were a landscape of healing scabs and fresh grease. The dull ache in his lower lumbar was a permanent roommate. He grunted, torquing a wrench on a seized bolt that felt like it had been welded on by the devil himself. "Dad, I need a green crayon." Dean lowered the wrench. He craned his neck, looking past the jackstands. His daughter Harper sat on a milk crate by the front office door. She was 9, with a mess of brown hair pulled into an uneven ponytail. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, a battered coloring book balanced on them. "Check the top drawer of the filing cabinet, kiddo." Dean called out, his voice raspy, from breathing in brake dust all morning. Under the stack of past due notices, he didn't want her here. A garage was no place for a kid smelling of volatile chemicals and failure. But childcare cost money, and money was a ghost in this town. It haunted the empty storefronts and the sparse, dusty traffic that rolled past Dean's bay doors. The sound of tires crushing gravel announced an arrival. Not a local truck. This was heavier. A flatbed tow truck groaned as it navigated the uneven lot, its air brakes hissing loudly before it shuddered to a halt. Dean slid out from under the Honda on his creeper. He stood his knees popping in a way that made him wince and wiped his hands on a rag that was already saturated with motor oil. Sitting on the bed of the tow truck was a machine that had absolutely no business being in a zip code like this. It was a custom European Grand Tourer charcoal gray, low to the ground, mostly engine and arrogance. It looked like a shark dropped into a muddy puddle. The passenger door of the tow truck opened. A woman stepped out. Dean squinted against the harsh afternoon sun. She didn't step down so much as she descended, her black stiletto heel striking the gravel with sharp precision. She wore a tailored white blazer that looked absurdly bright against the grimy backdrop of the shop, and tailored slacks that probably cost more than Dean made in a fiscal quarter. Her dark hair was cut in a severe, immaculate bob. She took one look at the garage, the peeling paint, the overflowing trash can out front, Harper's discarded bicycle leaning against the wall, and her mouth pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Dean threw the rag onto his workbench. He didn't smile. He walked out to meet her. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I severely doubt it," the woman said. Her voice was cold, precise, and immediately grating. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She was staring at her phone, typing furiously, with perfectly manicured thumbs. "But my driver insists you are the only mechanic within a 40-mile radius, which is a logistical failure I intend to correct with the county planner next week." "Well, until you fire the county planner, this is what you've got." Dean crossed his arms. "What's the issue?" She finally looked up. Her eyes swept over him. He felt the weight of her judgment. She saw the stained gray uniform shirt, the sweat on his brow, the frayed edges of his collar. He saw her mentally calculating his worth and arriving at a fraction of a cent. The vehicle lost power entirely on the interstate. She said, clipping her words. Complete electrical and mechanical failure. No warning lights. Just died. My usual team in the city couldn't diagnose an intermittent stalling issue last week, and now it's completely bricked. I have an international merger to sign in exactly 3 hours. I need this fixed. Now. It's a V12, Dean said, looking past her to the car. Custom tuning. European specs. Very observant, she mocked. Are you capable of doing more than identifying the obvious, or is this the extent of your expertise? Dean felt a hot spike of irritation beneath his ribs. He looked at her. Her name was probably something sharp, but he didn't ask. He didn't care. He was tired. His back hurt. He had a Honda to finish, and he was out of green crayons. Look, lady. Dean started keeping his voice level. I'm backed up. I don't have the diagnostic software for a $500,000 import. You're better off having him tow it the rest of the way to the city. Unacceptable. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and extracted a sleek black card. I don't accept no. I accept results. I am Vivian Hayes. I own the logistics company that probably supplies every tool in this pathetic garage. You will get it off the truck, you will find the problem, and you will fix it. She didn't offer the card. She walked past him, stepping carefully to avoid a patch of spilled coolant, and slapped a stack of crisp banded $100 bills under the hood of the Honda. There's $2,000, an advance. Fix it, and there's 5 more. Dean stared at the money. It was exactly what he needed. The property taxes, Harper's looming dental bill, the crushing weight of the mortgage. He hated himself in that moment. He hated that she knew she could buy him. He hated the cynical, exhausted part of his brain that calculated how many months of breathing room that cash represented. He looked over at the office. Harper was peeking out from the doorframe, her wide eyes fixed on the white-suited stranger. Dean swallowed the pride burning in his throat. It tasted like ash. Get it off the truck, Dean yelled to the tow driver. Vivian smirked, a tiny victorious curvature of the lips. I thought so. The tow driver unspooled the winch, the heavy metal cable scraping violently against the silence of the afternoon. The car rolled down the ramp with a dead-heavy weight. It didn't belong here. It sat in the center of Dean's Bay, dominating the space smelling of expensive wax and hot ceramic brakes. Vivian stood near the open bay doors, arms crossed, tapping her foot. She was making a pointed effort not to touch anything. Don't lean on it, she snapped as Dean walked around the front bumper. The paint is a custom matte finish. Your hands will ruin it. Dean ignored her. He leaned his hip against the fender, intentionally pressing his grease-stained overalls against the pristine metal. He didn't look at her, but he heard her sharp intake of breath. He reached under the grill, his fingers blindly searching for the latch. He found it. The hood popped with a solid, heavy thud. He lifted it, exposing the engine bay. It was an intimidating sight. A massive 12-cylinder block covered in carbon fiber shielding. Wires routed with obsessive precision. It was more computer than machine, a sealed ecosystem designed to keep people exactly like him out. My lead technician in the city spent 3 days running diagnostics on it, Vivian said from behind him, her voice dripping with skepticism. He ran every code, found nothing. I don't know what you think you're going to achieve by just staring at it. Engines don't lie, Dean said quietly. Computers do. Computers tell you what they're programmed to tell you. An engine tells you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. Spare me the blue-collar philosophy, Vivian scoffed. Can you fix it or not? Dean didn't answer. He leaned over the engine. The residual heat washed over his face, carrying a specific bouquet of scents: hot aluminum, synthetic oil. But beneath that, something else. He closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the pristine plastic covers. He needed to smell the truth. There it was. A faint, acrid scent. Ozone. Burnt copper. He opened his eyes. The smell was concentrated near the rear bulkhead, right where the main wiring harness met the firewall. He grabbed a flashlight from his belt, clicking it on. The harsh white beam cut through the shadows behind the engine block. "What are you doing?" Vivian demanded, stepping closer. The scent of her perfume, something sharp bergamot and cold vanilla, clashed violently with the smell of gasoline and sweat. "Are you just going to poke around blindly?" "Step back," Dean said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a gravelly edge of authority that made her hesitate. He reached down into the tight space between the engine and the firewall. The metal was still punishingly hot. His forearm brushed against the exhaust manifold. He felt the skin blister instantly, a sharp searing pain that radiated up to his elbow. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He couldn't afford to lose the angle. His thick fingers, calloused and scarred, traced the thick snake of the wiring harness. He felt along the underside, the part the factory technicians in their clean white coats couldn't see without putting it on a lift and dismantling the subframe. His index finger found it. A gouge in the thick rubber insulation. He traced it. It wasn't a rat chew. It was friction. The custom engine mounts were too stiff, creating a microscopic vibration that had slowly over thousands of miles sawed the main harness against a raw edge of the chassis. "I see it," Dean muttered. "You see what?" Vivian asked, a hint of genuine surprise breaking through her icy facade. "Your city mechanics relied on the computer," Dean said, pulling his arm out. A red, angry burn mark streaked across his forearm. He grabbed a shop rag and casually wiped the smear of soot off his wrist. The computer couldn't read a code because the fault was cutting the power to the diagnostic module itself. It's a dead short. He walked over to his tool chest. The drawers rolled open with a heavy metallic crunch. He selected a pair of long-reach pliers, some heavy-gauge heat shrink, and a roll of high-temp electrical tape. "A short?" Vivian sounded dubious. "A $500,000 car doesn't just short out." "Physics doesn't care how much you paid for it," Dean said, walking back. "Metal rubs against metal wires, fray sparks fly, things die. Same as a 20-year-old tractor." He leaned back over the engine. This was the hard part. He had to work blindly, relying entirely on the tactile feedback in his fingertips. He used the pliers to pull the frayed section of wire slightly away from the firewall. He had about 2 inches of slack to work with. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. The pain in his back was screaming now, a sharp stabbing sensation at the base of his spine. He ignored it. He focused entirely on the millimeter movements of his hands. He stripped the burnt ends with his thumbnail, a trick he'd learned in the military, twisted the copper strands together, slid the heat shrink over it, and applied the tip of a butane torch. The acrid smell of melting plastic joined the heavy air of the garage. Vivian watched him. For the first time since she arrived, she was silent. She watched the slow, deliberate movements of his hands. She saw the burn on his arm angry and beginning to blister. She saw the sweat soaking through his gray shirt. She saw the absolute terrifying competence in his posture. Dean finished wrapping the repair in high-temp tape. He wedged a piece of thick rubber hosing between the harness and the chassis to prevent it from happening again. He pulled back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of black grease across his forehead. "Try it," Dean said. His breathing slightly elevated. Vivian blinked. "You're joking. That took you 12 minutes. "Try it," Dean repeated. He didn't look at her. He started putting his tools away. Vivian hesitated. She looked at the engine, then at Dean, her expression a mix of doubt and an emotion she couldn't quite mask. Perhaps apprehension at the thought of being wrong. She walked to the driver's side door, opened it, and slid into the immaculate cream leather interior. Dean stood by his workbench. He didn't hold his breath. He knew his work. Vivian pressed the brake pedal and pushed the crystalline starter button on the center console. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The silence in the garage was deafening. Vivian's mouth opened to deliver what would undoubtedly be a scathing, triumphant remark. Then the starter engaged. The V12 didn't just turn over. It violently woke up. A deep guttural roar erupted from the exhaust pipes, rattling the loose tin on the roof of the garage. The floorboards under Dean's feet vibrated with the sheer mechanical violence of it. The engine settled into a smooth, predatory idle, a perfect, unbroken mechanical symphony. Vivian sat frozen in the driver's seat. Her hands hovered over the steering wheel. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, her eyes wide. The dashboard, previously a dark void, was lit up with telemetry data. Dean walked over to the open door. He rested his hand on the roof, leaning down to look at her. "Seems your logistics are back on track, Miss Hayes," he said quietly over the rumble of the engine. She turned her head slowly to look at him. The condescension was gone, burned away by the raw exhaust and the undeniable reality of what he had just done. In its place was something raw. She looked at the grease on his face, the burn on his arm, and then down at the $2,000 still sitting on the hood of the broken Honda across the bay. For the first time all day, Vivian Hayes had absolutely nothing to say. Part 3. The boardroom and the burn. Vivian didn't turn the engine off immediately. She let it idle, feeling the rhythmic, immense power vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of her shoes. The dashboard display showed perfect vitals, oil pressure steady, temperatures optimal. It was flawless. She pressed the ignition button. The engine died with a soft mechanical sigh. The silence that rushed back into the garage felt heavier than before. She unlatched the heavy door and stepped out. The air in the bay felt different now. It wasn't just hot and oppressive, it was charged. She looked at Dean. He hadn't waited for her reaction. He was already back at his workbench, scrubbing his hands with a gritty orange pumice soap. The water running from the utility sink was black. She walked over to the hood of the broken Civic, picking up the stack of bills she had so casually discarded earlier. She reached into her blazer pocket, retrieved her wallet, and counted out 50 more $100 bills. $5,000. A fraction of what she made in an hour. But holding it now in this grimy space, the paper felt strangely weighty. She walked over to the sink. She didn't drop the money this time. She held it out. Dean turned the water off. He dried his hands on a blue shop towel, leaving dark streaks on the fabric. He looked at the money, then at her face. He didn't smile. He didn't look grateful. He just looked tired. "The invoice will be on the passenger seat," he said. He took the cash. His knuckles brushed against hers. His skin was rough as coarse grit sandpaper. Hers was perfectly smooth, moisturized with creams that cost more than a set of premium tires. He didn't linger. He shoved the roll into the deep pocket of his coveralls. "Your arm," she said. The words slipped out before her rigid corporate discipline could stop them. Dean glanced down at his right forearm. The burn was an angry raised welt glistening with sweat. He wiped it casually with the dirty towel. "Occupational hazard. Have a safe drive back to the city, Miss Hayes." He turned his back on her, grabbing a socket wrench from his chest, and walked back to the Honda. The dismissal was absolute. In her world, no one turned their back on Vivian Hayes. People waited for her to dismiss them. They hovered. They placated. She stood there for 3 long seconds, an alien in a tailored suit, listening to the rhythmic clicking of a wrench. Then she turned, got into the tour, and drove out of the gravel lot without looking back. The drive to the city took 90 minutes. The air suspension swallowed the imperfections of the highway. The cabin was hermetically sealed, dual-zone climate control, keeping the interior at a precise 68 degrees. It was a fortress of isolation. Yet the smell remained. It was faint, but it clung to her clothes, intertwined with her cold vanilla perfume. Burnt plastic, ozone, hot oil. Every time she breathed in, she was back in that sweltering garage, watching a man plunge his bare arm into a boiling engine bay, because he trusted his hands more than a $500,000 computer. At 2 o'clock, she was seated at the head of a long mahogany table on the 42nd floor of her corporate headquarters. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked like a circuit-board rivers of traffic, flowing between glass towers. 9 men sat around the table. Lawyers, vice presidents, acquisition targets. They wore bespoke suits. They spoke in metrics, synergy, leverage buyouts, and strategic redundancy. "Vivian, if we look at the Q3 projections," said Richard, the CEO of the logistics firm she was currently swallowing whole. He tapped a sleek silver pen against a leather-bound folio. "The asset integration phase will require a temporary downsize in the maintenance divisions. We can outsource the fleet repairs to third-party contractors in the tri-state area. It's a cleaner line item." Vivian looked at Richard. She saw his perfectly manicured nails. She saw the soft, unblemished skin of his hands. He had never built anything in his life. He only moved numbers on a spreadsheet. "Outsourcing to the lowest bidder," Vivian said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Relying on diagnostics run by technicians who don't know the difference between a software glitch and a frayed wire." Richard blinked, thrown off rhythm. "Well, standard operating procedure dictates." "Standard operating procedure is why half our current fleet is bleeding efficiency," Vivian interrupted. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany. "Computers tell you what they're programmed to tell you. An engine tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen." The room went dead silent. Richard stared at her. She realized she had just quoted the mechanic. The man in the filthy gray shirt. She looked down at her own hands resting on the polished wood. They felt useless. They could sign away 1,000 livelihoods with the stroke of a pen, but they couldn't fix a single broken thing in the physical world. "We are keeping the maintenance division in-house," Vivian commanded, standing up abruptly. "And we are restructuring it. I want a complete audit of our regional depots by Friday. Meeting adjourned." She didn't wait for objections. She walked out of the boardroom, the smell of burnt plastic still lingering in the back of her throat, a harsh grounding reality in a world built on glass and air. October arrived not with autumn leaves, but with a driving, relentless rain that turned the gravel lot outside Dean's shop into a bleak gray soup. Inside, the temperature had plummeted. The space heater in the office was a glowing orange coil that fought a losing battle against the damp draft seeping through the cracked window caulking. Dean sat at the metal desk, a lukewarm cup of black coffee, resting next to a stack of invoices. He dragged a calloused finger down a column of numbers, the pencil in his other hand, hovering hesitant to write down the final tally. The math was brutal. It was always brutal. The $5,000 from the billionaire had plugged a massive leak. The property taxes were paid. The mortgage was current, but water always found a new way in. Now it was the shop's roof, and the compressor was making a terminal whining noise. In the corner, Harper was curled up in a beat-up armchair, wrapped in a faded quilt, watching a cartoon on a battered tablet. The volume was low, a tinny hum beneath the sound of rain hammering the tin roof. The deep, resonant growl of an engine cut through the drumming rain. Dean looked up. Through the rain-streaked window, headlights pierced the gray afternoon. It wasn't a flatbed this time. It was the charcoal Grand Tourer, its wide tires hissing on the wet asphalt as it pulled directly up to the closed bay door. Dean set his pencil down. He felt a sudden, inexplicable tightness in his chest. He stood up, his knees protesting the damp cold, and walked out of the office. He hit the heavy green button on the wall. The bay door rattled upward with a deafening metallic shriek. The car rolled inside, dripping rainwater onto the stained concrete floor. Vivian cut the engine. She opened the door. She wasn't wearing a blazer today. She wore a heavy black cashmere turtleneck and dark jeans. She looked less like a corporate shark and more like a person, albeit a person whose clothes still cost more than his car lift. She didn't speak immediately. She stood by the open door, looking around the garage as if seeing it for the first time. She noticed the buckets catching leaks from the ceiling. She noticed the worn-out tools. "Miss Hayes," Dean said, wiping his hands on a rag out of habit, even though they were clean. "Don't tell me the electrical tape gave out." "The repair's holding perfectly," Vivian said. Her voice was quieter than he remembered. The sharp, grating edge of condescension was gone, replaced by a tight, guarded neutrality. "Then you're lost. City's an hour and a half south." "I'm not lost." She closed the car door with a solid thunk. She walked toward him, her leather boots clicking softly against the concrete. "There's a vibration in the steering column. It only happens north of 120 miles per hour, but it's there." Dean looked at the car, then back at her. He leaned against his tool chest, crossing his arms. 120. Dean repeated, his tone flat. "Yes." "In the rain." "It happened on a dry stretch," she countered quickly. Too quickly. Dean stared at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, expertly concealed, but visible if you knew what exhaustion looked like. He knew what exhaustion looked like. He looked at it in the mirror every morning. She was lying. There was no vibration. "Keys," he said. She tossed them. He caught the heavy keyless fob out of the air. "Get in," Dean commanded. Vivian blinked momentarily, taken aback. "What?" "I can't duplicate a high-speed vibration in a stationary bay. Get in the passenger seat." She hesitated, then walked around the front of the car. Dean opened the bay door fully. He shouted back into the office. "Harper, stay put. Watch your show. I'm taking this out for a 5-minute spin." "Okay, Dad." came the muffled reply over the sound of cartoon explosions. Dean slid into the driver's seat. The leather was soft, pliant, and smelled of wealth. He felt acutely aware of his faded jeans and the faint smell of solvent that clung to his skin. He pressed the ignition. The V12 roared to life. He threw it into reverse, backed out into the rain, and dropped it into drive. The acceleration was violent, pressing them both back into the seats as the car surged onto the empty county road. The wiper blade swept silently across the glass. The cabin was insulated, reducing the driving rain to a muffled drumbeat. Dean accelerated hard. The speedometer climbed with terrifying speed. 60, 80, 100. The steering wheel in his hands was dead steady. No play, no vibration. It was a perfectly balanced machine. He hit 130 on a straight, empty stretch of wet asphalt, the engine howling a beautiful, aggressive note. He held it there for 10 seconds. Then he firmly applied the brakes, letting the massive ceramic rotors bleed the speed away smoothly. He pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder of the road next to a rusted chain-link fence bordering an overgrown field. The rain hammered against the roof. Dean shifted into park. He didn't turn off the engine. He turned his head and looked at Vivian. She was staring straight ahead through the windshield, watching the hypnotic sweep of the wipers. She looked small in the passenger seat. The aggressive corporate armor was gone. "The alignment is perfect," Dean said quietly. "The wheel balance is factory spec. There's no vibration." Vivian didn't answer right away. She pulled her sleeves down over her wrists. "I know," she said. "So why are you here?" "Miss Hayes." "Vivian," she corrected, finally turning to look at him. "My name is Vivian." "Okay, Vivian. Why are you sitting in my shop on a Tuesday afternoon lying about a phantom knock in a car that runs perfectly?" She let out a slow breath. It wasn't a sigh of exasperation. It was a release of pressure. "Because my boardroom smells like synthetic leather and dry erase markers." She said, her voice barely louder than the hum of the climate control. "Because for the last 3 weeks, I've been sitting in meetings, listening to men talk about profit margins and strategic acquisitions, and all I can think about is a man who shoved his arm into a hot engine because he actually knew how to fix something that was broken." Dean frowned. He didn't like where this was going. He didn't do romance. He didn't do charity. And he certainly didn't do bored billionaires looking for a blue-collar safari. "I'm a mechanic," Dean said harshly. "I fix machines. I don't fix whatever existential crisis you're having because your bank account got too big." Vivian recoiled slightly, the sharpness of his words hitting home. A flash of her old anger flared in her eyes, but it died quickly. "I'm not asking you to fix me," she snapped back, though her voice wavered. "I don't need fixing. I am incredibly successful." "Success and function aren't the same thing," Dean replied, leaning back against the door. "You can have a shiny exterior and still be a dead short on the inside. You drove 2 hours in the rain because my garage is the only place you've been in years where someone told you no." Silence filled the car, thick and heavy. The rain continued to fall. Vivian looked down at her hands. "When I was sitting in that car dead on the highway, my phone was ringing every 30 seconds. Millions of dollars on the line. And none of it mattered. All the money in the world couldn't make the engine turn over. You stripped away the illusion of my control in 12 minutes." She looked back up at him. "I didn't come here for safari, Dean. I came here because I just finalized the acquisition of a regional logistics fleet. 200 heavy-duty diesel trucks. and the maintenance division is a corrupt, bloated disaster." Dean narrowed his eyes. The conversation had pivoted so sharply he almost got whiplash. "What are you talking about? I fired the head of fleet maintenance this morning," Vivian said, her voice regaining its steady corporate rhythm. "He was relying on diagnostics replacing $50,000 engine blocks instead of finding the frayed wires. He was bleeding me dry." She reached into the center console and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She dropped it onto the armrest between them. "I need a master mechanic, someone who trusts their hands more than a computer, someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong." Dean stared at the envelope. He felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "I run my own shop." "Your roof is leaking," Vivian said ruthlessly. "Your compressor is dying. You're working yourself to the bone for pennies to keep a child in an office that smells like carbon monoxide. It's not a life, Dean. It's a prolonged survival scenario." "Don't talk about my daughter," Dean growled, a surge of protective anger flaring. "I'm talking about reality," Vivian countered, leaning closer. The scent of cold vanilla filled the space. "You have pride. I respect that. I wouldn't be here if you didn't. But pride doesn't pay for dental braces. It doesn't put a new roof over her head. Look at the contract." Dean didn't touch the envelope. He looked out the side window at the rain slicing through the gray air. He hated her in that moment. He hated her because she had ruthlessly deduced his exact breaking point, and she was pressing on it with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't want a boss. He didn't want to be a cog in her massive, sterile machine. But he saw Harper's face wrapped in that faded quilt shivering in the damp office. "Where is the depot?" Dean asked. His voice was hollow. 20 miles south of here," Vivian said. "You wouldn't have to move. You'd run the entire regional maintenance program. You hire your own guys. You buy your own tools. I just want the trucks running. The salary is base $140,000 full benefits and a signing bonus that will let you bulldoze that leaking garage and build a proper house for your girl." Dean finally looked at the envelope. It was a lifeline. A heavy, suffocating, golden lifeline. "Why me?" Dean asked. "You could hire any master tech in the state for that money." Vivian looked at him. Her eyes softened, dropping the corporate mask completely. For a fleeting second, he saw the lonely woman beneath the billionaire armor. "Because I trust you," she said simply. "You didn't care about my money. You didn't care about my title. You cared about the machine. I need someone in my world who deals in reality." They drove back to the shop in silence. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Dean pulled the Grand Tour back into the bay and shut off the engine. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He felt the weight of the envelope in his lap. It felt heavier than an engine block. Vivian opened her door and stepped out into the garage. Dean followed. Harper had emerged from the office. She was standing by the tool chest, a green crayon in her hand. She looked at Vivian, then at Dean. "Did you fix it, Dad?" Harper asked. Dean looked at his daughter. He looked at the leaking roof. He looked at the rusted Honda waiting for a suspension arm. Then he looked at Vivian. She wasn't standing with her arms crossed anymore. She stood quietly observing the interaction, her posture lacking the rigid dominance she usually carried. She looked like a guest who was afraid of breaking something fragile. Dean walked over to the workbench. He tossed the keys to Vivian. She caught them. "I don't wear suits," Dean said. His voice was gruff, devoid of any celebratory tone. "I wouldn't let you," Vivian replied. "I run the floor my way." If an executive from the city tries to tell me how to turn a wrench, I'll walk." "Agreed," Vivian said. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. It transformed her face entirely, making her look younger, less severe. Dean picked up the manila envelope. He didn't open it. He just held it. He felt a profound sense of loss for his independence, mixed with a crushing, overwhelming relief. The permanent ache in his lower back suddenly felt a little less sharp. "I'll read it tonight," Dean said. "I'll call your office tomorrow." Vivian nodded. She didn't push for an immediate signature. She knew how to close a deal, and she knew when to step back. She walked toward the driver's side of her car. She paused, looking down at Harper. "I like your drawing," Vivian said awkwardly, pointing to a piece of paper Harper was clutching. Harper held it up. It was a crude drawing of a tow truck carrying a gray blob. "It's your car," Harper said. "It looks like a shark." Vivian let out a short, surprised laugh. A real laugh. "It does, doesn't it?" She looked up at Dean one last time. There was no fairy tale romance in her eyes. There was no sudden passionate spark. There was just a quiet, profound respect between two people who lived in entirely different universes, who had briefly collided and found that they shared the same fundamental jagged edges. "Tomorrow, Dean," Vivian said. She got into the car. The engine fired up a controlled, powerful roar that shook the damp air of the garage. She backed out into the rain-slicked lot. Dean stood in the open bay door, his hand resting on Harper's shoulder, and watched the taillights fade into the gray afternoon. The transaction was complete. The world hadn't dramatically changed its colors. The concrete was still cold, his knuckles were still scarred, and the air still smelled like exhaust and damp dust. Dean looked down at the envelope in his hand. He tapped it against his thigh. He walked over to the wall and hit the heavy green button. The bay door rattled downward, shutting out the rain, shutting out the road. He walked back to his workbench, picking up a socket wrench. He had a Honda to finish. But for the first time in 10 years, he knew exactly how he was going to pay the light bill next month. And for the first time in a long time, the engine of his own life didn't feel like it was running on empty. Sometimes the greatest value isn't found in a bank account, but in the grease on your hands and the truth in your work. Dean and Vivian's collision proved that raw authenticity will always outrun superficial wealth. If this story of pride survival and unexpected connection hit home for you, drop a like, share it with someone who respects the grind, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, hard-hitting audio dramas. Keep your engines running and stay tuned.